On this blazing hot August day, we are going to be using our new gas splitter to prepare ash hatchet handle blanks. You can do this by hand, and I've certainly done this thousands of times. Some wood, though, is so tough to work with wedges, and it's brutal on the body and takes a really long time. And it's also just so hot right now that I've given myself heat exhaustion before trying to do this kind of stuff with wedges and sledges this time of year. I've got these 1, 2, 3, and then I already broke down the 4th of these ash half rounds. I did have to split them in half just to be able to load them in my truck by myself because they were too heavy. And just splitting them in half took me, with 3 large wedges and an 8-pound maul, 10 to 15 minutes to do a single split. So I was pretty worn out just splitting 2 of those in the heat yesterday. So I'm definitely looking forward to being able to use this new tool to break these down just as well, and perhaps even more so, and not exhaust myself and tear up my elbows. So the plan is to initially, when they're too large and heavy to pick up and put on the splitter when it's horizontal, I'm going to break these halves down into quarters or maybe thirds, throw them back in the truck, and then I'll be able to load them easily onto the splitter when it's in the horizontal configuration. And it's also a lot easier to line up where you want the wedge to go into the wood when it's horizontal too. That's the plan. We'll see how it comes out. First one went great. It was almost fun. So even though this isn't just 100% hand tools, I'm still putting all the same strategy into getting the best blanks out of here. This little tiny limb, believe it or not, there will be a pin knot in the wood associated with that little limb that probably goes right all the way through the material. I don't want that to be in the middle of a blank anywhere. Also, conveniently, kind of in line with it, I see some sort of vague little snarl, like a scar or something, probably where another real small limb broke off and has healed over. Those are pretty much in a line. So rather than just split this straight in half, I'm going to split right along this. And I've drawn a Sharpie line on the top of my log here that corresponds to that. That's the first split I want to do because it's going to put that knot right on the edge of a blank instead of in the middle. So I got this log half finagled in there just right where the wedge is more or less going to hit right on my Sharpie line. So I just got to fire this up and start doing some splits. It's almost like it's not my first rodeo, right? So just like I said, through the bark, there are these 2 internal knots. I missed my Sharpie line by a little bit. I'm a little off to the side, but that little snarl definitely corresponds to this scarred over limb. And you can even see where that was cut off several years ago. If you count those growth rings, you'll see how many years ago that limb was cut. This one, I'm gonna just break them down into pieces about this size and then think about and probably even draw out my next strategic splits. But that's all gonna be done in the horizontal position just because it's much more ergonomic and easier. So this log half is broken down to halves essentially. Working through. if it comes through on camera, but this is a 25-ton splitter, so it's not the most heavy-duty version. They go up to, at least for homeowner grade, about 40 tons of splitting force. Even though, however, even though this is perfectly clear-grained ash, the grain is interlocked, and it's struggling to split this perfectly clear-grained stuff. That's why I have to let the wedge go in a little bit, and then I have to stop advancing the wedge and let the motor RPMs come back up to get to full horsepower before I advance it again. So I go the first few inches only a half an inch to an inch at a time, otherwise the motor bogs down. This looks wonderful, looks fantastic, and so there's pros and cons to this kind of interlocked grain. You can see how it's just ripped apart, very rough and stringy and splintery. That's hard to break the log down, but that equates to a tougher handle. So this handle will be harder to break when it's finally dried and installed on an axe. My capacity here is about 25 inches, so I cut these logs to just fit in there. It'd be nice to have one, you know, could split 36, but I'm stuck at about 26-inch capacity. But that's about the longest logs typically show up around here anyway at log dumps. Ash is typical of a lot of other species where it will split much easier on the tangent to the growth rings than it does on the radius to the growth rings, and you can just see the difference. You see how rough, again, and splintery that surface is versus how relatively smooth that surface is. So my splitter is switched into horizontal mode, and I'm once again just going to try to work down from these larger sections to something like this, possibly a little smaller if I can, but there's going to be so much waste on these radial surfaces. Those tears go in quite deep, and I need to trim off almost an inch from either side. Ideally, in the end, I want something that's a little over 1.5 inches thick and at least about 3 inches wide. And the waste will be trimmed off with my patio bandsaw later on, so Mom's wood stove will be fully stocked with kindling for the winter time with those offcuts. I'm just going to work my way through these, hopefully have a whole stack of stuff, a couple of wheelbarrows full of premium handle stock looking like this. that was relatively effortless compared to doing it by hand with wedges, of course. So for instance, you end up with, when you do this with wedges, you're always fighting these last little bits off of here, and just really wears you out. Although that's a good sign, that's tough stuff. But we get about 35 or 36, something like that, of these blanks. Almost every one of them is just perfectly clear, true. Grain's a little bit wavy, but that's fine. It's more or less in line with the blank. Just super premium stuff. Some of this is what I call Neapolitan ash. So instead of the normal just off-white, it's this beautiful swirly kind of pinks and browns and yellows in there. And that stuff, the Neapolitan part, oh, it smells wonderful. So the next step is to bandsaw all the rough bits off of these with the patio bandsaw, trim the edges free of any drying cracks that are happening and getting deeper by the minute out here in this heat. And then dip the ends in paraffin, melted paraffin wax, and I also like to run these a couple of passes on each of the wide faces across a benchtop joiner just to clean it up a little bit more. Makes it easier to ride on, makes it so that in the future I can really see what's in the grain when I go to use it for a project. So great stuff. Show what you get out of a split billet like this. Here's a prepared blank. This has been trimmed, waxed, bandsawn, and then run across my joiner now. And I did just write today's date in the wood species. And then these have to go into a partially climate controlled space, i.e. my basement, and I'm going to cross hatch stack them and let them sit for at least a year, probably 2, before doing anything else with them. At that point, for ash in particular, they should be dry enough to go ahead and hang a head on. They may warp slightly in that time too, so I may need to run them over the joiner again after a couple years to re-straighten them if I'm just going to keep them as blanks. I can't get through, and ended up being probably closer to 50 of these blanks we're going to get out of this batch, these 2 logs in the round. I've worked through 2 wheelbarrows full already, and the ones I can't get to, I can't just leave them sitting out in the sun and the wind, because they'll get full of longitudinal cracks as well as end grain cracks very rapidly. So I packed them into as small a space as possible, and I'm keeping them covered with a light colored tarp to keep the sun and wind off as best I can. And I won't be able to get to those until tomorrow, just with the nature of all the other projects we have going on. A few hours a day is all I can really dedicate to this. So, and just making room for the stuff that's getting split and so forth. they often have to wait, but if I let those sit there for a week, they'll be ruined. So I get a day or two maybe under the tarp before they start getting full of cracks. Buys me just a little bit of time. It's a lot of trouble, right, to just get an axe handle. Well, I go through all this trouble because I want to make the best. And where I live in Kansas City, I've tried to just find hardwood lumber, and finding really good quality, straight, true grained hardwoods is extremely difficult. Any board I find seldom has longer than a 20-inch, 25-inch section of grain that's worthwhile, and having to buy a full large board and have a lot of waste doesn't make a lot of sense. So by just making friends with tree trimmers, I get this material for free. And then there's the work, of course, of breaking it down, but it's also using a reclaimed material that's otherwise just probably either going to get dumped somewhere and rot, or at best become firewood. So that's where I get most of my handle stock from. It ends up being the very best you can get because I've split along the grain and then carefully sawn in addition to that to capture the grain direction through the blank. In this form right here, the reason I get the blanks to this particular state is because they'll be stable and not get ruined as long as I get them again into like a basement environment where they can dry slowly. I could go ahead right now and rough some of these out, or all if I have time, with either hand tools or power tools. For instance, I could bandsaw the rough profile in. I would still have to leave them oversized though and let them dry for that year minimum before trying to hang a head on it. That's the crucial thing. The wood has to be fully air dried before you hang the head, or it will just keep shrinking and the head will come loose. That's the basic process that has evolved over several years of doing this for me to make the very best axe handles. If you like seeing this kind of stuff, check out some of my other videos. Thanks for watching.